Perfect. So today's webinar is the third in a series of webinars and events organized by the Association for Social Economics, and the two journals that the association owns, Forum for Social Economics and the Review of Social Economy. The Association for Social Economy or social economics more precisely, was founded in 1941, and its aims and objectives are to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy, to consider the personal and social dimensions of economic problems, and formulate economic policies consistent with a concern for ethical values in a pluralistic community. Therefore, as you can see, it has very broad aims and objectives which straddle across disciplines. And this is why we thought it was important in this series of seminars to devote one event specifically to interdisciplinary research. The other two events you can find recorded on the association's website, but also on the YouTube channel owned by the association. It's a webinar on policy-related research, and then a webinar on publishing and the publication process. Today's speakers are going to engage the question of interdisciplinary research, and in alphabetical orders are going to be Professor Amitava Dutt, who's Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. His areas of specialization are macroeconomic theory, development economics, international economics, and political economy, and has analyzed issues such as global uneven development and globalization, models of growth and distribution, and the political economy of war and peace. Then we have Professor Lisa Herzog, who's Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Groningen, and she works at the intersection of political philosophy and economic thought, and has such a long list of interests that I'm going to just mention a couple. So the philosophical dimensions of markets, liberalism and social justice, ethics in organization, and the future of work. And last but not least, Dr. Sara Stevano, who's at the Department of Economics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And her research explores how gender, class, and race relations shape the organization of paid and unpaid work and the associated well-being outcomes. She takes, and this is quite apropos given the theme of today's seminar, an interdisciplinary approach informed by development economics, feminist political economy, and anthropology. So given such a distinguished panel of speakers, I'll just shut up and leave the floor to them.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn to start, right, Roberto?
So I'm chairing formally. Yes, you are the first to go.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, I'm glad this is not a presentation on how to present, because my presentation slides are terrible. So instead, I'm going to talk about what I understand by interdisciplinary research and why it's very important, and also how anybody, but especially younger scholars, can publish more in this kind of interdisciplinary approach. So my talk is entitled Interdisciplinary Research, Importance and Challenges. So first of all, what does it mean? Well, there are other words that are also used: inter, multi, trans. It somehow suggests going beyond or mixing or incorporating ideas from more than one discipline. And discipline, of course, it seems very natural and obvious to us. In fact, I'm not at all comfortable with the word discipline, being rather undisciplined myself, but it is, as people have pointed out, socially constructed, the boundaries are not clear or fixed, and the definitions of each of these so-called disciplines is not clear. So here, um, I will focus primarily on the social sciences. I put also sciences in quotations. Um, in other words, that there are, of course, other areas of study or disciplines, as they're called, natural sciences and so forth. Uh, so those ought to be included as needed, but here I will discuss mainly what I call the what is normally called the social studies or social sciences. So examples of that are, you know, economics, sociology, political science, anthropology, psychology. Then I would include philosophy, theology, history, and then beyond that, of course, biology, ecology, physics, mathematics, and you can also include business, management, law, and things of that sort as well. These are usually how departments are named and how people are told that that's what you are. I remember friends of ours ask, you know, not a close friend who came to our place because it's my wife's acquaintance, asked, so what is it that you do? And my son, who was probably about 2 years old at the time, said, my dad's a communist. But what he wanted to say was, I think, that my dad's an economist. So that's was my uh, my identity, if you will. And so we think of ourselves as that, or we are told we are that. Okay, so that's what discipline is. So uh, while disciplines are so very important, there are signs that they're breaking down. The boundaries are breaking down. They're adjectives for disciplines representing another discipline. For instance, we have things like economic sociology, social economics, economic philosophy, and there are some other things, even econophysics, and so forth. There's also a tradition of combining with a conjunction or a preposition, like economics and philosophy, um, then philosophy, politics and economics, law and economics, etc., and also philosophy of economics. Now, there are also explicitly interdisciplinary studies on topics, issues, and geographical areas. For example, gender studies, development studies as representing issues, American studies, Asian studies, South Asian studies, Chinese studies, Latin American studies. There are also international studies, peace studies, etc. But these are often not departments. They are usually, with some exceptions, uh, in centers, institutes, they might have a major, but more usually minors in different universities. Incidentally, uh, the only place that I know, only country that uh, maybe I'm wrong about this, that has American studies uh, inside its own country is the United States. I've never heard of Indian studies in India, but in any case, so these are all meant to be interdisciplinary studies, and they bring in people from different disciplines to examine an issue or a problem. Now, the common link between all of this is disciplines exist and the boundaries, however, are crossed. Uh, Now, what I will do today, beyond the introduction, is to uh, start with some very simple ideas of knowledge and its divisions. I won't start by trying to define what knowledge is, but I will just, the talk is meant to be for only 15 minutes. Then I'll talk about how and why disciplines were formed. Then I will talk about some analytical concepts, issues, and aspects of society, quote unquote, with a capital S, I should have put it, versus disciplines. And then I'll mention some dimensions of analysis, uh, interdisciplinarity, why we need it, how it can be done, and the problems of doing it. Then I'll give a brief example of some research that I have and am conducting on what is called consumption and happiness. My other great love, I don't love inequality, I love to study inequality. So that these are all examples, but I'll stick to consumption and happiness. And then finally, what this talk should have been around about is publishing in journals, and especially the review of social economy. I should say that one of the main reasons why I was willing to be considered an editor or co-editor of Review of Social Economy is that this is a way of trying to promote breaking down boundaries, between so-called disciplines. So many of you are here, I suppose, because you are interested in this kind of work, but um, uh, I will still preach to the choir that this is something you ought to be doing, but with perhaps a little more um, 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 clarity in your own mind why it is to be done. So we have uh, divisions in knowledge. This started with all kinds of people, the Greeks, the Indians, I'm sure there are others, dividing knowledge between natural, social sciences, well, they didn't call it sciences, philosophy, arts, humanities, etc. So here I will focus, and for the purposes of RoSE as well, RoSE meaning the Review of Social Economy, is to focus on the study of human behavior and of human societies. And why has the study of these things being uh, put into disciplines, if you will? The main idea is that knowledge has expanded so much from the days of the early Greeks and the early Indians that you couldn't study everything. You had to specialize, you had to have the division of labor. And this is the story of why we are supposed to specialize. The alleged benefits of it are not only that it's necessary because we can't know everything, but that specialization of the division of labor has its benefits. Okay, just like specialization in the division of labor in society and firms is supposed to have benefits. Uh, you can compare this, of course, with Adam Smith's division of labor idea, which is the pin factory. Uh, that is, of course, for producing more. Okay, uh, the pins necessarily don't get better, but here we are not producing in that sense. We are producing knowledge in a vague sense, but it's not like more productivity to earn profits. Okay, at least I hope not. Um, but then you also have a comparison to the division of labor in society that was focused on by Plato, Hindu texts, which started the notorious idea of caste, and then Durkheim and others, which is another aspect of specialization. Now, knowledge is expanding so much, or supposedly it is expanding so much, that even disciplines are not enough. You have to specialize within disciplines and sub-disciplines. And so you often have discussions of interdisciplinary analysis, that is, different disciplines or different aspects of a discipline getting together to do analysis. So, so as I said before, one of the arguments for specialization and division of labor is this: too much is known, and therefore you can't know everything, and don't even try. The benefits, I've mentioned that too. However, the necessity or the benefits of something don't necessarily lead to the emergence of something. Okay, that would be a crude functionalist fallacy to say that, well, things happen because they're needed or because they bring benefits to whom or to some abstract conception of society. Now, also, I should point out, division of labor and specialization does not necessarily lead to division according to disciplines in its present form. Okay, uh, people don't know everything or cannot know everything. Well, we probably know nothing, but that's a different issue. Uh, but why has the division into disciplines occurred? I think this is largely from two forces. One is what is called professionalization and exclusion. Um, there's a book on Marshall written by Maloney here, who talks about using the sociology of professionalization, talking about how they're formed is by creating training in a specialized branch of knowledge with a course, subdisciplines, fields, hierarchies of learning. Another is monopolization, that is excluding people, okay, with advanced degrees, terminology, okay. Investment, I tell my students, is not what you think it is. It's creating, new capital, okay, for capital formation. Um, then by using mathematics, okay, by having journals and writing articles that nobody can understand except maybe three people, okay. But so these are exclusionary methods. There are also professional ethics, gatekeepers, associations, though at least for economics, as our friend George DiMartino has written, is we don't have that in terms of doing no harm or some other ethics like that. The other major force, I think, is vested interest in society and academia. Um, to separate the economy from politics, okay, so that uh, rich people can essentially do what they want to without government interference, okay, or to change human beings in such a way that can promote the profit motive, let us say, okay. That is by saying, well, social things are not important. You should be going where you can make more money, so we can make more money, and so forth. This is not a uniform process. Okay, sometimes there are ebbs and flows. Carl Polanyi has discussed, for example, how there are these movements that take place where the the markets get separated from society and politics too, although he emphasized society, and that leads to problems that in turn make a return to some greater integration between these different fields. So if you want to separate out these things in the real world, then what better way to do it is by making scholars study these separately as well. And now, um, Roberto, could I ask you to put up some fingers about how much time is left? 3 minutes left? Wow. Okay. Uh, I have been talking too much. Okay. Let me then not go into all of what I wanted to say is that in actual society, there are concepts, and by that I mean for markets, states, firms, consumption, and there are issues related to what is considered to be worth promoting or reducing, like inequality, poverty, happiness, well-being. And there are broad aspects of society, like, let's call it the economy, let's call it another, the political sphere and the social sphere. However, I'd like to point out that the association of each of these spheres or aspects of society with disciplines is absolutely incorrect. Okay, that to make that clearer, let me just say that. Okay, I'll skip this, although I love it. Okay, so here let's divide society with a capital S into three parts. Okay, the economy, society, and politics. However, these parts have intersections, okay? And in fact, all three can have an intersection. Now, in my own mind, I have yet to find an issue where there is a non-intersection. So all three might be combined together. So this is the issue of co-constitution. The other issue is, even if they're separate, the interactions between them are so big that to leave them out is to miss something, something important. And why so? Let me just say that the problem is that disciplines, or so-called disciplines today, involve concepts that are co-constituted, as I mentioned. So you cannot deal with them separately, or they are interdependent because they interact with each other. Finally, goals for people or groups or normative goals are not confined to one so-called discipline. Okay. Now, the problem, of course, is that this is the disciplines can have a nice thing. They're taken over by particular epistemologies, ways or methods, and it's good to have a firewall. Otherwise, if there weren't any, maybe economics would take everything over. And the second thing is, of course, we have jobs, tenure, journals, publications, and you need to have a foot in one discipline and one foot in an issue. Okay, so I'm sorry I didn't get to the main slides later, but perhaps that will come up in the discussion. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thanks a lot, Amitava. And I'm sure there's going to be plenty of time in the discussion section. So let's move on to the next speaker, who's Sara Stevano from SOAS. Floor is yours. You got 15 minutes. How do you want me to give you the time? You have to unmute.
I'm really sorry, something happened on my screen and I wasn't able to get back to this page where I could unmute myself. Sorry about that. So I'm going to start sharing, and I think I will be able to see you, Roberto. So if you use your fingers again, I should be able to see that.
Okay. I will also send a message in the chat just in case.
That's all right. That's all right. So let me start sharing again. Okay. So I take you can see my slides, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for organizing this webinar. It is my pleasure to be here to have a conversation about interdisciplinarity, which is something that I've been grappling with for some time. So I do have some thoughts and some questions, and I very much look forward to listen to what the participants also have to say. So what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to start by sharing some reflections on my positionality and my experience of interdisciplinarity, just to be clear on the terms on which I am thinking about interdisciplinarity from my perspective. And then I will talk about some of the risks of engaging in interdisciplinary work. And then to conclude on a more positive note, I will consider some of the opportunities that I think are given to us by engaging in interdisciplinary work. So I should just say I have some slides, but they are just basically pointers for some of the things I'm going to say. So do not worry about them too much. They're there just to summarize some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. But so to start with my positionality and my experience of interdisciplinarity. So I'm trained in economics, and I had a fairly standard training in economics at undergraduate level, although I did my undergraduate in economics in Italy, where I think it's common practice to provide training in sort of mainstream economics, but there was also engagement with other disciplines. So I had modules in law, sociology, geography, and so forth, which I think it's a good thing of these programs. And then I did a master in development economics at SOAS, University of London, where I was introduced to heterodox approaches to economics with a specific focus on development. And this has become my area of study and work, particularly in the fields of development economics and feminist political economy. Of course, I'm thinking about interdisciplinarity from the perspective of economics, although I take on board the point that Amitava started with, which is that we should be a little bit skeptical of what we mean by discipline to start from. But as a reality, we operate within some disciplines. And so the way I've been thinking about interdisciplinarity is particularly in terms of how I can be an economist who works across disciplines in meaningful ways. And the first time that I have encountered interdisciplinary work in a more formalized way, if you want, was when I did my PhD. In the course of my PhD, essentially I was exposed to two nested dimensions of interdisciplinarity. And this is because my PhD was funded by a center that was aimed at promoting interdisciplinary research in the fields of agriculture, nutrition, and health. And as such, I was interacting on a very regular basis with nutrition scientists, epidemiologists, public health specialists, and also agricultural and health economists. And as such, we were dealing with complex questions and issues in agri-nutrition or agri-health. One interesting thing that I have experienced was that the questions that we thought were worth pursuing were often not the same. And so there is something about how we frame questions in different disciplines. And not only, because I will come to this later, but I think that there are some important divides within disciplines that we need to be aware of that are quite central when we engage in interdisciplinary work. But the second dimension of interdisciplinarity in the course of my PhD was that my PhD project itself was framed to be an interdisciplinary investigation drawing on economics and anthropology. And as such, I've worked closely with a professor of development economics and a professor of anthropology throughout my PhD. And particularly at the beginning of the PhD, I tried to gain some knowledge in anthropology, focusing primarily on the use of ethnographic research methods. So, of course, I wouldn't dream of claiming that I am an anthropologist at all. And I wouldn't be able, for example, to teach in an anthropology department, anthropology modules. But particularly from a methodological perspective, which of course is embedded in a broader conceptual approach, the anthropological way of investigating, in particular the holistic way of looking at issues, did make a lot of sense to me. And so since my PhD, I have embraced the practice of working across disciplines, which in very basic terms, for example, entails reading what is relevant about a topic, regardless of the specific disciplinary viewpoint that specific texts are written from. Although, of course, even here there are some tensions because the organization into disciplines provides us with some guidance as to what we should read. And therefore, like when we wonder outside the disciplinary boundaries, there is a lot more work that we need to do in order to select what is relevant for us to read about a specific subject, I think. And in general, I'm committed to re-embed economics into the social sciences. And I think that economics has been evolving in ways, particularly some branches of economics, to elevate itself as a discipline above other social sciences. And I think that this process needs to be reversed. And in this sense, I do think that interdisciplinarity does not only hold promise for new or different lines of inquiry, but in some sense it is an imperative, particularly from the perspective of heterodox approaches to economics. Now we'll come back to this in a moment, but I think before getting there, I do want to talk about some of the risks of interdisciplinarity, because I think we do not talk about this often enough. And I would like to start with a quote by a geographer, Erika Schoenberger, who talks about the ways in which geography has become popular in other disciplines in a worrisome way. So let me just read this quote out loud. So Schoenberger says, "It seems to me that geography has become very popular lately in a kind of worrisome way. The good news is that people from other disciplines have suddenly become very geography-minded, but I'm not sure that this reflects a genuinely interdisciplinary engagement where one really seeks to work in and through different disciplinary cultures. In some respects, it looks more like disciplinary reductionism, where the insights and understandings of a discipline are boiled down to a set of facts that become data for another discipline." And perhaps some of you are already familiar with this paper, but if not, I would recommend reading it. And if my slides can be made available to the participants, I'm very happy for this to be the case. You do have an hyperlink on the slide to the paper. But I think this notion of disciplinary reductionism is quite important. And I think particularly in economics, I think the risk of disciplinary reductionism is at least twofold, because on the one hand, dominant economic approaches tend to be recognized as legitimate by those in other disciplines who are interested in incorporating some economic insights or perspectives in their work. And for example, I've seen some of these in the work on agriculture, nutrition, and health that I was mentioning earlier. But on the other hand, also the risk of disciplinary reductionism is particularly important in economics in comparison to other disciplines, I think. And this is due to the so-called imperialist tendencies of economics to colonize other disciplines, which is something that, for example, Ben Fine has written extensively about. And so there is a quickness in economics to label as non-real economics somehow, research and work that engages with other social sciences, work that employs qualitative methods, and that, for example, centers history and power. And so indeed, I think power relations are very central when we think about interdisciplinarity, because of course there are hierarchies of power, not only between disciplines, but also within disciplines. And so it's not uncommon to see that disciplines represented in interdisciplinary institutions or interdisciplinary projects are not given equal value. And indeed, what we see is that the dominant paradigms across disciplines then tend to be reproduced through interdisciplinary work. And I think this is something that merits consideration. 5 minutes, perfect. And so on this note, I would like to move to think about some of the opportunities, though, that are given to us by interdisciplinary engagement. And so even here, I would like to go back to this point about thinking of differences in ways in which we frame questions, definitely between disciplines, but also within disciplines. And I would like to share another quote by Branko Milanovic, who's an economist working on global income inequality that some of you might know, which comes from a blog post which is about Marx. And this quote caught my eye because precisely it talks about these questions, which to me are quite important when we think about research in economics, but particularly in interdisciplinary ways. So Milanovic says, whoever studies Marx can never forget the grandiosity of the questions that are being asked. For such a student, and using supply and demand curves to determine the cost of pizza in his town will indeed be acceptable, but surely will never be seen as the prime or the most important role of economics as a social science. So again, I think this is quite telling, because I do think that in economics there has been a process of narrowing down the questions that are asked that perhaps goes hand in hand with that idea of specialization and division of labor that Amitava was talking about in a more specific way, though, within the field of economics. And I think it is important to consider how we frame questions in ways that allow us to capture the social, political, and historical context, the historical content of economic questions. So I very much liked that figure that Amitava showed before, that shows that there are always overlaps between society, the social, the economic, and the political, essentially. And I think that this requires a drawing on conceptual and methodological approaches that allow us to make the questions we ask bigger, exactly to counter that process of narrowing down questions too much. But I think I would add to this that even when we ask smaller questions, because some smaller questions are important, I think, it is critical that we have approaches that allow us to provide the big answers to those small questions. And that, I think, specifically means connecting phenomena that can be observed at the microeconomic level with macro processes. But also to connect exactly the economic with the social, the political, and the cultural as well. And the political economy provides, I think, an advanced framework to consider these interrelations. But in particular, I think feminist approaches to economics and political economy have been of interest to me because they are different from other branches of economics in that they have engaged with a discussion of epistemological and methodological approaches in a very explicit way. And in particular, they have been calling for the importance of pushing, expanding the boundaries of economic research through dialogue with other disciplines, particularly across the social sciences, but also through the use of mixed methods and primary data collection. So I do want to stress how primary data collection, which is still very marginal in economic research, in my view, I think has an important role to play to exactly expand these boundaries of what is considered to be economic research in an interdisciplinary way. And I think that the training in primary data collection should be more central in training of, in methodological training for young economists. So to conclude, I just would like to stress the importance of being open to interdisciplinarity for heterodox economists. And of course, those training or practicing political economy in many ways already do so, I think, perhaps though in implicit ways. But to go back to the idea of risks that are involved in engaging in interdisciplinary work, I think the ways in which we do interdisciplinary research require thoughtful consideration and humbleness, also to listen and try to understand debates that occur in other disciplines. And I do think that heterodox economists do have an advantage and in a way should be leading the way in fostering meaningful interdisciplinary work, because we are more used to read across disciplines, and due to the structural exclusion from economics departments, of course, not all economics departments. We do have stronger connections with colleagues and friends in non-economics departments. So I think that these relations should be nurtured, you know, even particularly, you know, from for early career researchers. So when we do PhDs and so forth. But yes, I think this is where I will leave it. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Yet another inspiring talk, and it's going to lead the way on to our third speaker, Lisa Herzog, who is going to talk about some thoughts on interdisciplinarity. Lisa, floor is yours. Again, do you want me to wave my hands or? Okay.
5 minutes would be good. Although I'm last, and I have the challenge of now saying something that has not yet been said. Thank you, Amitava and Sara. I totally agree with the point about disciplines being constructed and being power structures. I'm a runaway economist. I've always been at the intersection of philosophy and economics. And then at the time when I was I was deciding to do a PhD, I just didn't find the places in economics that seemed sufficiently open to interdisciplinary research at all. And that's why I ended up being in economics, only to then get lots of people, well, they don't say this to you directly, is this philosophy, but you hear these kinds of noises. But I am a committed practitioner of interdisciplinary research. And I'll, on the one hand, zoom out a little bit to the bigger picture and then go down to some very concrete experiences and practices of what it means to publish interdisciplinary work in today's world. So here is the bigger picture, and I recommend a book to you by a fellow philosopher, Elijah Milgram, which is called The Great Endarkenment. The subtitle is Philosophy for an Age of Hyperspecialization. And what he does there, among many things, is a very broad book. He draws a picture of our societies becoming more and more specialized. He uses this term hyperspecialization, with people sitting in these niches and knowing a lot about niches, but there being a real challenge of how specialized knowledge can still reach the center and political discourse, public decision-making, and so on, if so many individuals and also so many scientists and researchers are so hyper-specialized. So there are really deeper political questions here about how you can run a society, a democratic society, in an age of hyper-specialization. And one thing that Milgram emphasizes is what he calls interface management, and how important that is for societies with hyper-specialized knowledge structures. And what he means is that when you bring knowledge from one area to another, there will inevitably be processes of simplification, boiling it down to the essences and so on. But that can be very dangerous, because certain qualifications about the environment in which a claim holds or about external validity issues might then not be communicated across these the boundaries of these niches. And I think that is very important. And there's almost a kind of ethical imperative that at least some scientists do that kind of interface management, I think. But it's combined with another challenge, and that really leaves us in a kind of dilemma, which is, and that's from other authors in philosophy, that we shouldn't do epistemic trespassing. And I like this term. It means that if you are an epistemic authority in some area, if you claim to know more than others in a certain field, which in a way is a deeply undemocratic thing to do, but that's what we need to do when we believe that expertise is real, then you can really only claim this expertise, this epistemic authority, for the field you're really an expert in. And what's very damaging to public trust in science is when you have scientists that are specialists in one area, and then in public discourse, they speak about anything else, but they are actually no specialists at all, and they still claim this authority. And I think that contributes to creating an image of scientists as just some kind of elite that is just about power and money and influence, instead of the kind of humbleness that Sara already mentioned, that each of us is a specialist only in a really narrow field. Even those of us who try to combine fields, it's still narrow compared to all the other fields that are out there. So that's the bigger picture. And now I'm going to talk about one concrete example and some lessons for what it means to do interdisciplinary research. And I've chosen a paper which is actually in a way only, in quotation marks, intradisciplinary, in the sense that it combines different areas within philosophy, but sort of at the boundaries of other fields. That was a paper that I had huge trouble publishing. It now found a home, but it took me years. And it's about a comparison and critical discussion about how algorithms make decisions and how Hannah Arendt discusses human decision-making and what this tells us. And I had this eureka moment when I was thinking about algorithms, remembering some stuff from Arendt, then returning to her texts. And I presented this paper many, many times, and there were always enthusiastic responses because people thought, oh, this is interesting to compare these things and to learn something about algorithms, which is important for our societies, given that algorithms take over so many areas of life. But I couldn't get it published. And the reason is that it brings together two discourses which are really located in different academic communities. And that's one of the lessons that I learned. I mean, I had different experiences before, but with this paper, it really drove it home for me. I think today academia is really organized in terms of discourses, and those can be within disciplines. Some of them are actually already sort of interdisciplinary, and sometimes they are pretty hostile towards each other, have some kinds of suspicion towards different fields. Sometimes that suspicion can actually come from past experiences of unjust treatment by another discipline. So, for example, one paper I wrote, which was actually on the methodology of interdisciplinary research, funny enough, we got one reviewer from philosophy who was quite positive, and then another reviewer from anthropology who got really upset about some stuff we wrote there. And I think this resentment stemmed from probably having been characterized in a certain way by philosophers before. It was about whether morality is always universal or you need to take local specificities into account. And that's, of course, something where some deep identity related issues for anthropologists are at stake, because they look at the concrete examples and they care to really describe specific cases in a lot of detail. And they accused us philosophers of being sort of too generalist and thinking morality is the same everywhere. And we were trying to negotiate exactly that kind of problem, the tension between particular cases and more generalizable normative claims. But the paper got then rejected because one of the reviewers was from a different field. And we felt a bit insulted because the review was so aggressive. But in retrospect, I would say, well, probably that the person who wrote the review had lots of bad experiences with philosophers, so maybe that's why this happened. And with the Arendt and algorithms paper, it was almost in all cases, there were some Arendt people who had critical things to say about which of the 753 papers about Arendt I had not yet quoted. And then there were other reviewers who were from philosophy of technology who claimed that I wasn't giving them enough details about algorithms. And at some point I was really thinking, okay, this is a paper that's never going to be published. And then I was lucky enough to find a journal where the reviewers agreed in the end. But what I learned is that for interdisciplinary research, one major challenge is really to manage the literature. And there is a strategic side to that, because you want to get past the gatekeepers, the reviewers, but it's also a problem in substance, because sometimes there are different discourses that talk about quite the same things, but they use a different vocabulary. So even if you do a very careful keyword-based search in literature databases, you might not find other stuff. And it can be very difficult to then even to understand where to start to read around. And for me, it was often sort of chance that I found one piece that had this one footnote that led me to a different literature. And then suddenly I understood how a different field or different discourse functioned. And then I could take it from there. And one experience for the kinds of interdisciplinary sort of social philosophical issues that I work on is that sometimes it can be very helpful to actually look at what's called gray literature. So policy reports, reports by journalists, popular audience book by journalists, the kinds of pieces that create a certain overview over a field, so you understand, okay, those are the important pieces, those are the important authors, and that can really help to build bridges. But in the end, for me, I'm at a stage where I've come to realize it's just too much work to do it all on one's own, and one needs to collaborate for interdisciplinary research. Sometimes it's just a call with a friend from a different field in which you ask, well, do I understand these things correctly? Is this really where the state of the art is? Sometimes it's much more intense and it's really grappling around, okay, the sociologist sees organizational culture in this way. What can a philosopher say about this? What's the normative dimensions? What normative assumptions go into the sociological research? And this takes time. This can be sometimes emotionally taxing in the sense that you think you're friends and then you realize you disagree on things, but it's actually just a misunderstanding because you need to figure out what you're actually talking about. And one thing that I think is a bit going wrong in the way academia is currently structured is that, at least in the Netherlands and Germany, the countries where I mostly work, there's a lot of funding for doing interdisciplinary research projects. But in a way, it should be the more experienced people doing the interdisciplinary research, because the PhDs often first need to get a foot into one of the fields. And it takes a lot of effort when you're a supervisor of an interdisciplinary PhD project to make sure that that person then gets a good preparation for the academic job market and is sufficiently secure in one or maybe both fields. I'm part of a bigger interdisciplinary project in Groningen, and there the PIs have come to realize that it's actually better to think about these interdisciplinary PhD projects that we have there, thank you, as being sort of 2/3 in one field and 1/3 in another field. Because if you start a PhD project with a sort of 50-50 approach, then that person is not at home in any of the fields. And unfortunately, or at least that person can be perceived as not being at home in any of the fields. And that can make the job market situation for that person really difficult. And you all know what the job market is like. So there are really difficult questions of responsibility. If we ask junior researchers to do interdisciplinary research, are we doing them a favor? And I mean, the problems are obviously interdisciplinary in nature, but how can one do this if the power structures of academia are still very much structured around disciplines? And some of them are more open than others, but that I think is an ongoing challenge, and I'd be curious to hear whether anyone knows about successful attempts to overcome this. So finally, a bit more about publication strategies. A few things that I realized can help is that one is very clear in the introduction of a paper about why interdisciplinarity matters, because a philosopher might not be willing to read 3 sections on ethnographic or whatever other material unless they understand why that is necessary. So explain to readers from both fields, or I mean, mostly, it depends. If you go for an interdisciplinary journal, the audience is interdisciplinary, but sometimes you would also have an interdisciplinary paper, but a disciplinary audience, and then you need to explain to these people why they should bother to read something from a different field. Also, show to which literatures you're relating in this paper. And that's also a matter of delineation. Also, this is what I'm not doing. I'm bringing these 2 or maybe 3 things together, but at least for papers, you cannot do everything. If you bring too many discourses together, it feels messy to readers, and it's just too much to treat in depth in one paper. If you write a book, you have more freedom. That's why I love writing books. But for papers, you need to limit yourself and be very clear. And also, I think one needs to think about publication outlets pretty much from the start of a project and think about how to frame papers such that they make sense for a certain discipline. Maybe not at the very beginning when you start to articulate a question, but for example, I'm in a project right now with a sociologist and another philosopher about institutional decay. What does it take for institutions to crumble from the inside, as it were? And we collected ideas and arguments and so on. And then at some point we decided, okay, the first paper we're going to write is going to be for a philosophy audience. And then maybe afterwards we can do another one for sociologists. And then we'll have to frame it quite differently. And lastly, and this is sort of obvious, but it's necessary to say it again and again, you have to be patient. And it might be a matter of bad luck that you find the combination of reviewers from the different discourses at a journal that can then really evaluate it appropriately. It also depends a bit on the editors, but the editors might not know all these discourses either. So you might have to have several goes at several journals, but that doesn't mean that it's bad work. It just means you need to have more time and think about how you can go from one journal to the next if necessary, and not take it too personally if it doesn't work in the first place. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
So that was perfect. Very well behaved speakers. I'm impressed, and that's a lesson to everyone in itself. So if anybody has any questions to the speakers, just write them down in the chat. And I would encourage the speakers themselves potentially to think about questions to the other speakers. But if anybody has anything to ask, just...
Maybe I can start with one while people are thinking about a question, because I wanted to ask Sara about her interdisciplinary PhD experience, whether you felt you had the right institutional framework for this, and whether there were things that one can learn for other institutions that worked well, or maybe things not to repeat in other places. Maybe you could speak a bit about that.
Shall I? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I'm sorry, I didn't go much into the details of that particular project in the presentation. Just in the interest of time, I went for a bit of a broader picture, but I'm very happy to say a few words about this. So regarding my specific PhD project across economics and anthropology, I felt I was the institutional environment was just perfect. Because I was located officially in the economics department at SOAS, which is a department that is that takes a pluralist, heterodox approach. So actually, political economy is a strong component of what is done in the department, and therefore I do think political economy is in itself already quite interdisciplinary. And so there was a lot of openness towards a PhD student in economics, also seeking to learn something from anthropological approaches and bringing some of those into their own work. And then, of course, on a more, if you want, personal level, also the two supervisors I've worked with understood each other very well. And so that was, of course, very important. And in fact, I think I was incredibly lucky to experience that co-supervision throughout my entire PhD. So all of my supervision meetings always took place with both supervisors. And so that kind of engagement actually was very important from an interdisciplinary perspective, because from those conversations with my two supervisors, who I should name actually. So one is Deborah Johnston and the other one is Harry West. So that institutional environment, I think I was, it was incredibly easy in a way, to the point that I didn't think much about some more critical questions about interdisciplinarity and how I would position myself after my PhD. And I wasn't even sure that I wanted to stay in academia, but this then happened somehow. But I became more aware only after the completion of that project, how to think of myself as somebody who is an economist, but also has these interdisciplinary skills. And I think, you know, again, I'm lucky enough to be again in the economics department at SOA, so where I can be this type of economist. But I am aware that this would not be possible in many other economics departments. And when I was looking for jobs, I did consider many times whether I would be happy in a non-economics department, and I would have done so if you know, if this job did not come through. So I think that you know, I had a very nice experience working across disciplines within my PhD, but I think there are still questions in terms of where to publish your research and how you're going to position yourself when you look for a job in an academia which, as you were saying, like, is still very much structured around disciplines, so whether we like it or not. So yeah.
There is a question from the audience. Plamen asks, how do you pass the gatekeepers? Many economics journals are both too mainstream and monodisciplinary. If you don't mind, I'm going to piggyback on this question and ask a question to you three, where I would like to ask you to put on your both author's hat and editor's hat, because Plamen's question is very relevant, but there is a sense in which even if editors in economics journals were trying to do their best and were indeed open-minded to interdisciplinarity, I think that it's just extremely difficult to deal with genuinely interdisciplinary submissions. And I think it's worth sharing your views both about how you pass the gatekeepers in certain journals, but also the kind of difficulties that there are objectively, given the way in which the profession is structured, in dealing with interdisciplinary papers, because I think that would help people kind of understand how to present their own work. Lisa's touched a little bit on this, but can you please extend on it?
If I could take a shot at it. Sometimes we exaggerate the problems faced by interdisciplinarity. I think both of my colleagues, I would blame a little for doing that, because you know, these discourses or exclusion happens just as much within so-called discipline as elsewhere. I mean, if you take economics, for example, heterodox economists find it extremely difficult to publish in the so-called high-ranked journals, okay? Or a methodologist would find it difficult to publish in what is called a journal specializing in some field, and vice versa. They protect their own fields. So in fact, interdisciplinarity is not specifically a problem for exclusion. In fact, there are all kinds of, as I have faced that within economics journals very much. And not, let me also tell you, not just by orthodox scholars, but even heterodox economists tend to be very, very tribal and don't try to reach others. So rather than fight these different wars, why not find the real war, which is to break down disciplines, okay? Now, you're quite right that editors, you know, my personal idea is, well, at my age, I can do this. I can read, you know, different so-called disciplines about a topic that interests me. And I've been doing that for the last 30, 40 years or so. But for young scholars, I would say that if you happen to be in a discipline, well, most of us are, unless you're in development studies, which is fine too, or gender studies, have one foot in your discipline, okay? Try to understand that, but also try to look beyond it. And by look, I don't mean like Gary Becker or even George Akerlof, who, although I admire him, has nothing useful to say about identity, I believe, although he's so widely quoted on that issue. And George Akerlof is one of the more reasonable economists, I think. So look beyond that and try to learn from others, like Lisa said, maybe not collaborate, maybe have a chat with them. But remember, you're not going to staple together two people's views about something. That is dangerous, absolutely dangerous, especially if they are not broad-minded and very egocentric about this is the way economists think. Okay, if you ever hear any economist say that, get away from that person. Okay, and I'm sure the same holds for philosophy too. You have sharp differences within philosophy as well. So I'm going on and on. Let me just say that as an author, I've faced difficulties which are not specifically about interdisciplinariness. Secondly, as an editor, I think that we do and should send to a variety of different people from different disciplines who are open-minded. So, and rejections, if they seem like the kind that Lisa mentioned, and say reject, I would reject the rejection completely. Okay.
Who wants to go next?
Shall I go next, Lisa? Yeah. I mean, I just want to add something quite brief, that fundamentally I agree with Amitava that I think what is important are sort of divides and tribalisms, if you want to use the terminology you have just used, also within disciplines. And like you, I am very aware of the difficulty for economists taking heterodox approaches to publish in those, top ranked so-called economic journals. But there are, I think, an increasing number of options that are available for publication, which are important and that I've used in my own work. And of course, for me, having this focus on development was also quite important because that gave me access to a number of journals in development studies that are very open to interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work. So that was very good. I do think, however, that because of these divides within disciplines, we need to think about these divides feed into interdisciplinary work. Because I do have a worry that sometimes the interdisciplinary work can be quite reductive when only dominant approaches from specific disciplines are legitimate when we engage in an interdisciplinary way. And Plamen is asking, yes, please give names of journals. So I'm sure we can all chip in, and I'm going to write something in the chat box on that.
Review
yes.
of Social Economy.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so I can't talk about economics journals, but okay, I'll tell a story about one thing that I once did. I'm not particularly proud of that. So I was on a tenure track in a department in political science, and there were some people who just fetishized certain journals. I had once heard from a colleague at a conference that a certain political science journal, if it publishes political philosophy at all, it only does so in the form of an X on Y paper, so author X on topic Y. And I had, by chance, working on other stuff, discovered something where I thought I can do an X on Y paper, and I wrote it. And miraculously, it actually got in. And as if the world spirit wanted to make fun of me for being so opportunistic, I actually got really nice reviews that led me onto completely different new fields. So it was actually a really good experience in a way. Don't do that, except for know the journals. In the sense, so this tip that I had gotten from this colleague about, if you want to try to get into that journal, as a political philosopher, the best chance on a white paper, if I had to make some systematic argument without a historical author, it would probably have backfired completely. But by chance, I then had this idea for an Axon white paper, and it worked out. And I mean, there is always a matter of luck in there. But knowing the journals and reading them, seeing what kind of papers might have a chance in them, that is certainly something one can generalize. Now, about the reviewer perspective, there is a real difficulty in the sense that many of our usual standards of quality are actually from the disciplines. And if you do something between disciplines, I mean, the cynical view is that you just don't want to live up to the standards of rigors of the main fields. That's what I sometimes heard. But in substance, it is really not so clear what you use as standards of quality. And that means that it can be difficult to evaluate articles and to really understand what their contribution is. One thing that I try to do when I get to review an interdisciplinary journal or to act as editor, I always try to find people from both fields that it draws on. But then there's also the additional question of what's the contribution here really? There is a bad form of interdisciplinarity, and Sara touched a bit on this, which is here's an idea that people in field X have known for centuries. Now I'm introducing it into another field, and isn't that great? I mean, the Akerlof stuff on identity to me feels a bit like this. This is basic social psychology expressed in an economic model, and suddenly it's wonderful. I mean, I was really pissed when I first read this, to be honest. So that's something that I don't think editors should support, even if the reviews were sort of positive. There's maybe one legitimate version of it, which is to be very open about discourse A having done certain things, and here is why this is relevant for another discourse, and then maybe introduce it. But just smuggling it in as something new, that's not okay. And that's what I, as an editor, would see very critically. But other than that, just try to find open-minded reviewers who can really evaluate the quality. And then in the end, it's also, to some extent, a judgment call, because whether it's interesting or not, there is no matrix of criteria if it's between disciplines. So sometimes I ask another editor if I'm not sure, but in the end, there will be a bit of a subjective element there. That's just, but arguably that's the same for all other papers in editing as well. It's just maybe a bit less.
Okay, let me ask a question, slightly tongue-in-cheek. Isn't it the case that very often, especially when you co-author, you try to do interdisciplinary work, what actually happens is that you're actually writing in a field that is not yours, and you just enjoy kind of, so rather than doing something which is truly across boundaries, you're doing something which is outside your field, and therefore you feel it's interdisciplinary work. And the reason I'm saying this is because, I'm guilty as charged myself. So I have co-authored, and I loved Lisa's list of things to keep in mind when you do interdisciplinary research. So having a colleague from the other field, if you're submitting to, say, a political science or a philosophy journal and you're an economist, is absolutely fundamental, because the languages are different. You may just send the wrong signals. You have a perfectly good paper, but the editor just doesn't get it because you're using the wrong language, because you're presenting your work in completely the wrong way. So you get a co-author on board. The question is, doesn't it happen sometimes that you're just, toying around with a discipline which is not yours? Can it not happen? How do you avoid that and do something which is truly across disciplines?
Could I just start with that? First of all, I would like to go back to the word that Sara introduced, which is humility. Which is, when you say a discipline is yours, you should realize you know very little about what you're talking about. Okay? So to say that you know your discipline and you're venturing into something outside it which you don't know about is partly being scared, but partly lacking humility, which is to say that you think you know something. In fact, most of the experts, and I can speak of this from, say, macroeconomic theory of the neoclassical style, know nothing. Okay, they just what you call bullshit. Okay, but perhaps I'm being aggressive and lacking humility, but I often bullshit too. So that's the first thing you got to get rid of. And this problem will not disappear if you work with somebody who's an expert in some other field. You have to always ask, what is this person also humble? Okay, is this person also somebody who can point me to some literature so that I can understand it and evaluate it? I'll give you a very good example of an area which has become complete bullshit, I think, because I've taught graduate classes in it. It's called international political economy. The American side of it, American political economy, is a nonsensical combination of neoclassical economics and Olson or the median voter model. Okay, and with some institutions thrown in. That is not interdisciplinary research too. So I would say, don't think about discipline, okay, to start with. Yes, you have to publish, you have to get tenure, so these are important issues. But also start from perspectives that actually start being interdisciplinary. And the one person I can think of who is a beautiful master of that, who's claimed by both economics, sociology, and politics, is Karl Marx. Okay, and there are some others too. So don't think yourself as an expert in anything. You're not.
So can I go ahead, Roberto? Or because Paolo, I think, has a question, or you want to come in now?
Well, yes, if I may. First of all, I appreciated very much all of your presentations and and the issues you raised. I would like to ask your opinion about an issue. Sara especially has often mentioned some keywords that I think are important in our case, which are heterodox economics and economic policy, political economy. Now, why are these words important? There is a mainstream, and we tend not to agree with the mainstream. The mainstream believes that economics is a science which can be investigated independently of any surrounding context. And so once you know economics, you can deal with it, whether it's in South Africa, India, China, or the United States. It's always the same things. That's why it's so easy for people from the World Bank to go abroad, stay 5 days in a hotel, and explain what's going wrong with that country. Now, the heterodox economists usually have a different approach. They believe that there is an environment that the economy is embedded in, and that you have to understand that environment, okay? And I'm speaking about not only a natural environment, but a social environment. And so you have to understand that, you have to study that. And this is what makes them usually speak about their discipline, not as economics, but as political economy. Now, my question is, would you really say that political economy is economics made interdisciplinary? That is to say, is political economy just economics plus sociology plus philosophy plus so on? Thank you.
Can I say something to this? So thank you, Paolo. I think your question is, I think, very important. And I was thinking before about this, particularly when I was listening to Lisa's presentation, because and I do wonder what Lisa thinks from a philosophy perspective, because I think Lisa was talking about interdisciplinary work, so engaging with other disciplines in various ways. And I think it was clear when you were talking, for example, about the importance of when you write interdisciplinary work, you need to state why it is important that you engage with that issue in an interdisciplinary way. Now, this, for example, in a lot of my papers drawn, they were drawing on my PhD work, which was interdisciplinary. I wasn't often particularly explicit about that the need of being interdisciplinary and why it was important. And I think because, and this connects very nicely with what Paolo was saying, that I think that perhaps we're talking about slightly different things, because of course, in terms of some of what I've been doing, and I agree that a view of political economy simply as being economics linked back to social sciences, I don't think that this is what political economy is. But essentially, I think that this is one way to reconnect economics with that social environment that you're talking about. And what is important for me is to reclaim these approaches as being economics, actually. So I do not necessarily want to say that this is interdisciplinary work. This is political economy work that should be considered economics in the way in which it is structured, which is about centering those interrelations between the economic, the social, the political, and the cultural. So it is interesting because I think depending on what kind of debate we are situated within, I think we think about the need to engage with other disciplines with different aims and purposes. And yeah, so I think this is quite important to reflect on these differences, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I can take over from here, but let me maybe first briefly say something about what Plumman writes. What if you argue against the editor's own views? That can be perfectly all right. I mean, if it's the substantial views, totally, that's not the problem. The problem is if you do something that is against the editor's views on what constitutes a well-done paper. And you can assume that the editors have been in their field for a while and they roughly know what they're doing, hopefully. And if they think that there's some substantial flaw in how you set up the argument or how you use the data and so on, then they will not let you pass. And if there's a sort of a gray area about whether, if you have a different approach than what the editor thinks is a good way of addressing a question, and that can be sometimes a bit vague, but if you make an argument against something that the editor thinks in substance, that should not at all be an issue as long as you bring convincing arguments. I mean, this is how debate makes progress. And then about this issue of what makes something genuinely interdisciplinary. I mean, there is, I guess, a psychological dimension there about the extent to which you really try to understand the other side, or to which extent you're just sort of slightly instrumentally using it for something you want to do. For the projects that I've done that can be called interdisciplinary, there was always somehow a subject matter. For example, private debt in the pre and post 2008 financial crisis. And then as a philosopher, there's sort of always, at least the way that I do philosophy, a normative question about what is the right thing to do here. And for that, you draw on certain theories of justice or moral philosophy. And in that sense, what I often do is trying to bring together a normative perspective, and then you need to defend a certain version of a certain theory of justice or so, and a certain subject matter. And to understand the subject matter, I really need to read up from sociology, economics, whatever it is, or co-author with someone, and to really try to understand the phenomena. And then this gives you, and if it works well, it gives you really a way of rethinking a certain area. And doing this as a sort of economic philosopher, my aim often is, but this is not like out of aggression or something, but it's often sort of rejecting a certain mainstream economic conceptualization of certain issues, just because by using them, you're obscuring important aspects, and by looking at them from a different perspective, you can actually open up new perspectives. But I guess it is always a bit of a struggle, you know, how exactly do you do it? And I don't have a recipe. And this project on institutional decay, where I'm currently busy with a sociologist and a fellow philosopher, we are at a point where we've sort of brought together our different building blocks, social ontology of institutions, certain psychological and sociological views, and then some rough idea about how these mechanisms of decay function. But when I looked at the paper again this week, I was like, my dear colleagues, we need to do more work to get the conceptual framework here coherent, and we need to be clear on how concept from organizational studies relates to that concept from social ontology. And we really want to have a unified framework here in which it's clear how these things hang together. And that's going to be the hard work of really integrating it, and hopefully we'll manage. But that's also how I think you can then make progress, and not just patch things together, but really try to get a new unified perspective. Is that an answer, Roberto? I mean, I still find it a difficult question. So.
If I could just add a little bit and try not to talk too much, it is that I think one needs to distinguish in one's mind between getting and keeping a job and publishing papers and included in that, and doing what you think is important. And also, let's also make it clear that what we enjoy and have fun with, okay? Now, many of the things we talk about publishing and so forth, is about the first issue, okay? Perhaps at my age and stage in life, I can forget that part completely. But even if you think you are, as Lisa says, a philosopher, I do not consider myself an economist anymore, okay? And when I hear my political science colleagues say, well, as political scientists, I cringe, okay? So we have to forget about disciplines while remembering them for the purposes of jobs. If somebody wants self-promotion, that's their business. I think it's a bad thing to want to do, but hey, you know, do what makes you good, okay? But disciplines as they exist today are partly matters of power, partly matters of exclusion, and partly matters of simple ego of the leaders. Who's referring to me? What are my students doing, and so forth? So the starting point, the political economy is a word that I like, but I would prefer to call it socio-political economy, but we are stuck with review of social economy. Look, it's not social economics. It is not an adjective for economics. It is looking at a construct called economy. Political, focus on the political side, but society encompasses everything about human societies, okay? So in that sense, it doesn't tell us how to do it, but I think the first point is to be clear, what are you doing? That is, there are no disciplines. So like John Lennon.
And can I disagree with you a little bit, just a little bit?
Sure,
It's
sure.
rare that
Absolutely.
disagree with you. I've been like this, and realized that this is sort of strategically unwise in the sense that we should reclaim these titles and tell people, look, this is also part of what philosophy or political science or whatever is. And I mean, I do quite a lot of media work, and then the journalists always ask me, what should we put as your title? And for some time I was like, don't put anything. I don't feel like I'm competent in any field. But no, hell, I do publish in these fields. So yes, I'm a philosopher and I have a degree in economics. So right, philosopher and social scientist, whatever. I think we need to be also self-confident that these sort of small niches, they exist, but we shouldn't talk them and make them smaller than they are and make them less visible by always sort of excluding ourselves from the disciplinary label. So in that sense, I agree with the general spirit of what you've been saying. But when it comes to academic positions and the presentation in the media and so on, I think we can also be confident. And I'm not less philosophical than other people just because they do more technical stuff. It's also philosophy. Philosophy is broad.
No, I mean, if I could just respond to this point directly, Lisa, I did not say that one should give up disciplines in a discipline-centered world. One should, again, if you appear and challenge other people's views, are you really improving the world, or are you promoting yourself as somebody who's an expert? Okay, that's for you to decide. Okay, but for me, I think it is very important to keep in the back of the mind there are no disciplines, and as more we subscribe to this idea, I'm an expert at something, the more you reveal yourself to be an ignoramus. Not you, one.
Since we are trespassing boundaries, may I suggest that we trespass the role boundaries and ask Roberto what his view would be, what his answer to my question would be?
I'm probably the worst person to ask. Okay, I'm going to give an answer that is very roundabout, and that's the following. Since my PhD, all my friends and relatives have been asking me, what do I do for a living? And the saddest thing to say—
You're a communist. You're a communist.
Well, by the way, I don't know if you know that, but that's a famous Che Guevara anecdote. Apparently, he became the chairman of the Central Bank of Cuba because there was this meeting in the middle of the night. They were all knackered right after the revolution. And somebody asked, who's an economist here? Because we need to appoint the president of the central bank. He understood who's a communist in here, and he raised his hand. So this is the anecdote, as Fidel Castro used to say. So you're in good company, Amitava, although, of course, the confusion goes the other way. Back to Paula's question. The answer, so the saddest thing is, to the day, I haven't been able to give an answer. So on the one hand, I understand Amitava's point. I feel extremely uneasy to classify myself as anything, but at the same time, I do sympathize with Lisa's point. And I think that's strategically very important. So suppose somebody in the mainstream asked me, what are you? The easiest answer for someone like them would be, well, I'm a social scientist, because that would confirm that people like me are not actually economists. So I think that Lisa has a very important point there. So I am an economist. That's going to be my first answer, although I realize I'm a political economist. And in everything I do, there is an element of everything else, just like you described, Paula. And the truth of the matter is, if you're a good, whatever we want to call it, economist or social scientist, there will be a blend of different disciplines, or at least concerns about the society and economy and deep philosophical issues. So writing a technical paper which has to do with inequality without any cognizance of the underlying normative and ethical issues, I think makes it a bad paper more than anything else. So this is not a very useful answer, perhaps, but that's the best answer I've got. I've never really theorized what I do. I straddle disciplines because I find it the natural way to do the stuff that I'm interested in. But I think Lisa has a very, very important point there. So I don't know whether I'm an expert in anything, but I am an economist. I've been trained as one, and that's what I do. And I think it is important to say it out loud. And I would encourage anyone in the audience, young people, to do pretty much the same, because it's, the easiest thing for the mainstream is to classify us as something which is not, the real thing. Did I answer your question, Paolo? Kind of.
I don't expect a specific answer. I was just thinking, since we're saying anecdotes, I mean, I do remember that one day I was rather upset about my situation within the economics world, and a friend of mine, an economist, mainstream economist friend, who is a friend nonetheless, said, well, why don't you move on to sociology?
Yeah, exactly. Sara?
Can I add that I think that I agree with Lisa. I think that there is something about reclaiming certain ways of doing economics or specific disciplines in broader ways that entail interdisciplinary engagement, although they're not only that. But there is a point of reconciliation that I see between what Amitava was saying in terms of the importance of thinking beyond disciplines and this process of reclaiming specific disciplines. Because, to think about it in very pragmatic terms, I think we are aware that when we teach in economics departments, there are specific expectations that students have in terms of, I always get asked these questions very often, even SOAS, which is a place that attracts a lot of students who are interested in pluralist approaches to economics. They wonder if, for example, the dissertations should entail some econometric exercise, because if they don't do that, then you want to be perceived as a real dissertation in economics, right? And I think, therefore, precisely to think beyond disciplines, it is the first step that is necessary is for us to be able to say that economics is not, in this case, on the econometrics, right? But it is going beyond that. So I think it is part of the same, like we all want the same thing, essentially. And I think a part of it is through reclaiming what economics is, and then maybe further down the line is even to think beyond disciplines. So yeah.
I am quite aware of time. There is one last question in the chat, unless somebody else wants to chip in. So Plamen is asking, would not interdisciplinary research also involve building research on theory, statistics, and history, economics, original tripod, prior to World War II? Any thoughts from the speakers?
I have a thought, but I don't know if I'll get an opportunity to share my slides that I can go into. I have difficulties with problems, issues like paradigms or even discourse, because I don't know what they mean. So what I proposed is a six-fold division of any study, and I hope that people can correct it or not. So, and this means epistemology, empirical, axiological, ontological, and what is to be done, action. Okay, so and here the ontology would have to include history as well. Okay, so I think that one needs to have a holistic, by holistic I don't mean any mystical, but a sort of all encompassing picture. So at least when you specialize, you know what you're leaving out and why. So yeah, all of these things have to be have a room in what you do. History is absolutely important, but again, history doesn't mean pleometrics.
Sara or Lisa? Lisa, you want to go first? You unmuted yourself first.
Yeah, well, I'm not an economist. I can't claim to be an economist by training or by institutional affiliation. So I'm not in the best position to answer it. But I would say the methods you choose depend on the question you want to answer. And one thing that I think economics could benefit from a lot, and Sara, I think, is sort of doing this, is to integrate qualitative and quantitative research much more. There's a very good book by an economist called Peter Spiegler called Behind the Model, where he argues for integrating qualitative and quantitative research. And in that sense, I mean, one could then distribute this onto theory, statistics, history. I think there is a lot of statistics being done that is insufficiently grounded in qualitative research and history and a sort of broader understanding of the institutions and the phenomena at hand. So that's something where I see a lot of potential for improvement. And just one last sentence on this. All the big data analysis suffer from the same issue. Now, big data stuff with artificial intelligence analysis and so on is becoming big fashion in lots of social sciences, but they have exactly the same problems if they are not sufficiently grounded in the actual phenomena. And how do you get to the phenomena if not through qualitative research and history?
I mean, I don't have really much to add. I kind of like those words that I see in the question, theory, statistics, and history especially. I would add power to the list. But yes, I think in any case, interdisciplinary engagement is one particular way that we can use within a broader conceptual approach. And I think perhaps what would be useful is to engage more explicitly in ontological and epistemological questions in terms of how we understand the economy as a reality and how we go about studying it, essentially. And then we make other choices based on those more fundamental questions.
Okay. I don't know whether there are any more questions. Yes, Plum, of course, space limits are a big issue when it comes to publishing journals, but that's why it is difficult to write and include everything in, properly in a given paper. But still, I think plenty of the insights of today's session of the webinar, I think, can be kept in mind when writing research in an interdisciplinary fashion. The three speakers have provided very different perspectives on this issue. And I think there's plenty of points to take home. So hopefully I would like, no, don't worry about bombarding with questions. That's exactly the point of this. So a round of virtual applause to our speakers. I encourage you all. And thank you very much. All this is going to be put online just in case you're interested in seeing this again. And the meeting is now over. Thank you all very much again, and hopefully see you soon.